I won't describe the treatment yet, because if I do so now, I'll lose you. What you should know is that I'm 33 years old, of solid physical health, good levels of the new good cholesterol, low levels of the bad, proper pulse, no chemical dependencies, a professional failure, and I'm sitting solo on the Frecciarossa train waiting to depart from Roma Termini for Modena by way of Bologna. I'm in Italy for my honeymoon. I was married in September, 9 months ago, but we delayed the trip for better weather. Back on Piazza di Paschino, at the very posh G-Ruff Hotel, a 17th century townhouse converted into a temple of Italian design, Annie, my wife, is still asleep in the palatial king bed, an original piece by the famed furniture designer Guglielmo Ulrich, as is all the room's furniture, and after whom the room is named, and about whom I speak as if I've got a clue who he is. I don't. I'm going to Modena to find a physicist. Because of the terms of my contract, I'm not allowed to name or acknowledge him in any way, publicly or privately, until our project is complete, and he has decided if he wants to credit me. For that reason, I will simply call him the physicist. Though if you're that curious, it shouldn't be too difficult to find the one famous theoretical physicist native to Modena. I need to find the physicist because he owes me a story, his story specifically. More specifically, the second half of his life story, from our present moment all the way back to what he calls the Great Realization, the moment when he had a breakthrough in perception, as he describes it, after which he excelled in the study of physics, the result of which is his groundbreaking, though still controversial theory of quantum gravity. I'm not allowed to name that either. Everything from birth up to a year before the Great Realization I've already got, but it's the realization that matters. It is my ticket out of a sizable debt hole I created when I failed to write a book promised to one of our nation's largest publishers. Publishers who paid me a rather sizable advance I can't pay back because I blew it all on things like 4 days in the junior suite of the luxury G-Ruff Hotel. Many dark-suited women and men in a Manhattan high-rise are eagerly waiting to give me a legal suplex if I don't deliver. The good news is that post-treatment, I'm able to forgive myself for getting into such a position, and I feel grateful for that. Yet, no matter how profound the treatment was, how life-changing, and it was those things, I realize I can't ignore that the debt is still very real, still my problem to solve, and worse, that it haunts me beyond its financial implications. It's the last thorn stuck in my foot from years spent walking through thorns. Except not only is it keeping that time alive and keeping me connected to it, it's also got the power to infect the new life I've been gifted. And so even in my happiness and clear mind, I also feel anxious enough about the day's potential that I couldn't bring myself to eat anything from the G-Ruff's impressive AM spread, not even a prosciutto slice or cube of melon to go with my morning cappuccino, which, now in the gut, has me feeling about as eager as possible for this train to come awake and race me closer to closure. The solution is simple. All I've got to do is find the physicist, get the rest of his story, and finish the job I was hired to do, which is to ghostwrite his memoir. Indeed, through a sequence of events that can seem either cruel or felicitous, depending on which side of a life-changing treatment you find yourself, I found myself in a position where, by ghostwriting the physicist's memoir, I could cancel my debt with my publisher. Whenever I turn in a new ghostwritten section, the money I'd normally receive in compensation is instead deducted from my negative balance. The more of his life I write, the more of my life I get back. All right, I'll pause for now. There you go. Cool. Thank you.
All right, hey everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Good to be here with my friend Will, my neighbor.
Yeah, thanks for being here, neighbor.
Good to see you all to celebrate this book. I have this old, venerable hardcover, but there's all these garden fresh, recently harvested paperbacks over there, so make sure you get one of those and bend it. That was great. You mentioned, that section sort of mentions the treatment, which is obviously sort of this core experience in this book around which the whole thing sort of revolves. And in that passage that you were reading, we're sort of in the present of the novel in Italy. But I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the character before the treatment. How would you describe where that person is and what's going on for him?
Yeah, before the treatment, the way I would describe him is extremely, extremely depressed and suicidally depressed. But the book's very funny, so don't freak out if that sounds like a complete downer. It's mostly laughs, I promise. In a state where the mind has been completely hijacked by depression, and so the book is in some ways. The book begins in some ways when this person has just very recently kind of been liberated from the prison of the mind. And so the world feels anew because they are, in a way, anew to it. Yeah.
And you describe depression so well in the book. It's one of the amazing aspects of the book because it's such a difficult thing to describe, a complex emotion state like that. And I think one of the ways you describe it is as sort of like an excessively ordered mind. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that and the way the character engages with order.
Yeah. So depression is strange, and I think that a lot of people have a misperception of how it functions in people's lives. And in reality, it's a relentless effort by the mind to explain what's going on around it. The world is chaotic, it's blunt, it has no concern for what you really want from it usually. And depression is a way that the brain can come up with a solution to everything it's presented with, which is that usually the reason things are the way they are is because you're awful. And everything's awful and you really shouldn't be here and there's no point to anything. And it creates very elegant systems to prove its point over and over. So no matter what a person who's really lost in depression is experiencing, depression has a way of convincing you that this is in fact proving its thesis over and over. So it gets to the point where you can't ever escape it. And then what starts actually as a kind of derangement of mind becomes reality. You forget what reality used to be like, and it becomes what's real, and everything else becomes the illusion. So it's a very elegant system, kind of hallucination is a way I often describe it to people.
Yeah. And so this character is kind of in that experience. He's an artist, then he's sort of a reluctant short story writer who finds success, and from there he kind of begins trying to write this big novel, but is kind of, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of where he goes from there and how the depression is affecting him.
Yeah, so he gets sort of caught up in this situation where he's convinced people to give him money to write a book that he has probably no business writing. But something that depression is really good at is it'll convince you that anything that's good news is secretly bad news, and it's just everything in life is just one Trojan horse after the next coming to really screw your day up. And so the first thing he does is writes this book of short stories, but he does it almost completely by accident. And in some ways that's why it's a success, because the brain wasn't even sort of involved. He's sort of blathering and people like the way it sounds. But when it comes time to actually make something, what happens is this confrontation with yourself and your ego, and it's this stuff that anyone who's tried to write anything or like apply to a college or anything, you feel this where they said suddenly you're supposed to like know how to do something and you can't. Your brain has been torn apart by the fog, or in this case, in his mind it's called the mist. And what he should be doing is writing a book, but he can't, and instead everything becomes a cruel reminder of all the reasons why he never should have been able to be allowed to write a book in the first place. It's this kind of immense imposter situation.
Yeah. How did you, the mist is such a great sort of like metaphorical way of describing that. How did you end up choosing that as the way of depicting it?
I mean,
or what did you like about it?
It's sort of around if you look at a lot of people's description. I mean, there's actually, you've maybe seen it during the Warriors games, but there's often a commercial for a bipolar depression medication, and the first line of the commercial is, "My bipolar depression makes me feel like I'm living in a fog," which is great for a San Francisco audience. People really relate to it. And so, but it's around. People have always sort of described it as this way, but something I wanted to make tangible was in a lot of writing about depression, people keep it in the head a lot. And for me, it was a very physical experience. And it was so awful that someone could be sitting right next to me telling me, that they love me and everything was, we're going to get through it, it's going to be okay. And it's like, it wasn't that I couldn't even hear them, I couldn't even see them. It had totally changed my ability to perceive what was happening right in front of my eyes. And so I wanted to make it this sort of sinister interruption, which is what it feels like, this interruption that you've gotten lost and you go further and further and further into it. And it kind of helped, I think, being in the Bay when I wrote the book. Truly, it was like this thing was around like a lot, and it felt at times beautiful and sinister. And like anyone who has mental illness will tell you there's times where like depression for me was the most consistent thing in my life for 20 years. I knew it better than I knew anything else. It was the one thing that stayed the same, and in fact matured with me, and kind of like I knew it. And there's a kind of elegance it has in its horrible designs.
Yeah, there's this great moment sort of early in the book where the character kind of realizes that, this thing that they just assumed was a prison that they had to be in, they read this article by Michael Pollan, essentially, or this article is read to them.
Yeah.
And they have this realization of like, oh, this is a cage I can get out of.
Yeah.
And that sort of, but they're so familiar with the experience of it.
Yeah, I think when depression's presented to most people, and it certainly was in my case, it was sort of, well, this is this thing, and it's probably going to just be here the rest of your life. That's how they said it. And it's like, we can give you some pills and stuff, like maybe it'll get better at times, but it's here to stay. And then all of a sudden, this psychedelic therapy stuff started trickling into the consciousness, and when I found out about it, I was completely blown away, and it seemed impossible. But it's not.
Yeah. So that's sort of like where the trajectory of the book goes. It's towards this therapy, and the narrator sort of alluding to it throughout. And I wonder if you could describe a little bit sort of that experience. You render it without giving too much away. You render it in the book in this sort of really like formally interesting way. Was it? And it's also sort of a kind of notoriously difficult to describe in language experience.
Yeah.
Did you try a lot of entryways into describing it, or was that the first one you picked?
Yeah, so to describe the experience for people who aren't aware about psychedelic therapy, though I'm guessing by this point most people do, but in general, what you do is you take a very large dose of psychedelics. Usually in the case of depression, you take psilocybin mushrooms. It was something I did in my life, completely changed my life, and I took a big 5-gram plate of mushrooms and took it at like 10 in the morning, and by 4:30 in the afternoon, something was very different. And so it really liberated me from the disease. But psychedelic experience is like notoriously hard to explain to people because you lose space and time, which are fundamental to most narrative, and you lose the self. So the speaker's gone as well. And so you're really in a cluster when it comes to trying to make someone like want to know what's going on. And then when you add on top of it the fact that much of what you're experiencing is akin to an extremely hallucinatory dream, people are like, okay, I've heard enough. I don't want to go into it. And at first I'd made the mistake of trying to explain it in traditional narrative terms. And like making it, I took my experience and really tried to morph it to something that the book needed. And my friend, the novelist Gabe Habish, who's very talented and wrote an incredible book called Stephen Flurry, he looked at me and he was like, this isn't the way to do it at all. And what he actually said to me was, it was like very creepy. He was like, there's a book you should go look at that uses these, and I won't explain it in case anyone hasn't read the book, but it uses graphics to manipulate text. And the book was called Ill Will, which I thought was cool. Very good book. And so by using this sort of technique where I almost make it like a choose your own adventure thing in a way, but the key is actually it makes it more akin to what psychedelic experience is like, which is that you can pick one little thing and zoom in on it, or you can look at multiple things happening at the same time and see how they're all interrelated with each other. And it was actually one of the great learning experiences, which was throughout the book, was how can a book, and it tries to do it in a number of different ways, how can a book account for like psychedelic experience and psychedelic logic in a novel that people would actually want to read? And I think it's an important question to ask because these things aren't going to go away. Frankly, they're going to be in people's faces more and more and more as it goes on. And I think it's exciting to think like how can the novel adapt to this thing that's going to become crucial in a lot of people's lives.
Yeah. And it's interesting, I think, you described obviously what happens to the narrator and your own personal experience of this and like how it shifted your experience of depression. But I wonder if you could like explain a little bit more how that perception actually shifted. Like, how did things look different after the therapy? What like specifically had changed about your experience of awareness?
Yeah, so not to get too lost in a kind of meditation talk or something, but anyone who's ever meditated before, you'll hear the teacher explain over and over and over again that there's a difference between what you're thinking and the thing that's witnessing the thinking. That in your mind there is this thing called awareness that's seeing stuff, and that in the same way that if you've ever sat with someone who's getting really anxious before going into a party or something, from the outside you can tell that they're just lost in thought, that their mind has kind of gone down a rabbit hole and it's there. But you can sort of step out of that. Psychedelics, what it does is it takes you out of it and lets you see what you thought was your reality was depression. Is not that at all. It's truly just noise. It's the mind has gone haywire with thought. So then when you've gone through that, there's this really intense absence in your experience. And it's the absence of what you used to think was the most real thing in the world, which is the thoughts in your head, your mind. It really quiets it down. And in my own like personal experience, I mean, it basically like the easiest equivalent would be like it was going from living in black and white to color. I mean, just all of my sense data was suddenly there to be experienced because it wasn't going through this filter of depression. And a lot of people will describe that how suddenly they can hear music. They've never really heard it. They'll be like, I've never really heard a song before. Or in 20 years, I haven't heard music. Or I haven't tasted food in 20 years. And that's because you're just experiencing things as they are. You're not really judging them. They're not running through this filter. They're not being intellectualized or fit into a narrative. And that's sort of one of the big components that the book explores, is that like depression and anxiety are storytelling diseases. They're telling you a story about your life, but the story has gone completely out of control. And so it's almost like the story is just gone, but you're there in it each second that it's unraveling.
Yeah. But this is like a little bit of a tangent, but I'm curious. I mean, one of the cool things about a paperback release is that some people have had the chance to read the book, you know? And I wonder, have you heard from any readers or friends or people who have had experiences with the therapy or been inspired to do the therapy after reading the book? Or like, what has that experience been like?
Yeah, some of them might be in this room. A lot of people, and I've heard from just like a lot of people who, it's like a sad thing when you get an email from someone and they're like, that's exactly what it's like to have depression, because you're like, I'm sorry that you know what that was like, but I'm also psyched that I got it right. In a way. You know, like, I'm bummed, but you know, like they're like, that's exactly what it's like. That's what it's like. And but it has, I get emails quite often actually where people are like, this gave me a sense of what could be possible or something. And that's important to me. I mean, books mattered to me. You know, I grew up in a kind of rural part of the country. Like, books were a space of access. And when I, like in my own experience, saw that Pollen book and learned about how to change your mind and read that and learned about psychedelic therapy, I mean, that saved my life. You know?
Yeah.
And
books are such a huge part of this book too.
Yeah.
There are so many books within. There's the novel within the novel that is being written by the main character. Mm-hmm. That's kind of his well, I won't say too much more about it without spoiling, but he's writing this novel about West Virginia. There's Dispatches, which plays a huge role in that. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about sort of the experience, and then there's also Ravelli too, the physicist, or the physicist who is inspired by Ravelli, as we learn at the end of the book.
Carlo's cool though. He was cool.
That's good. Yeah, that's good.
Very good.
But yeah, I mean, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the experience of weaving in those texts, or how was that a conceit or an idea something you knew you wanted to do, or did that sort of arise as you were working on the book?
It happened very organically as I was doing it, and I started writing the book relatively recently after I had myself done psychedelic therapy. So there was things that I was sort of learning about my art process in real time. And one of them was this constant anxiety that I think is pumped into most American artists' brains, which is this obsession with being like an original, which I think is a great scam. And so I would see things like bubbling up, and I'd be like, "Oh yeah, but is that really like my idea? Because that feels like something I learned how to do in dispatches, when I read that."
Yeah.
So then I was like, instead of hiding it, why don't I just lean 100% on it? Mm-hmm. In part because that's something that psychedelics are so good at teaching you, is that you're this complete composite of different things, experiences, people, all that different stuff. And so as I was writing it, it's like these are all different ways where like essentially foundational components of psychedelic experience got manifested in how the book's experienced. So no sooner is the writer speaking about something in the book that it brings them to another book, which links to another book, which links to another book. And that's how reading has always felt to me too. It's like one book always sort of teaches me the next one to read, but they also taught me how to write the next one. And I love that sort of daisy chain. It's called a daisy chain of echoes in the book,
Yeah, there's a lot of wisdom in the book about the creative process in a lot of, the character is a writer, obviously, so struggling with those things, but, just in terms of, liberating yourself from kind of being afraid if something's not working, for example. That's something that arises in the book a lot. And one of the great parts, I think, if you are a creative person yourself, reading the book is kind of seeing and getting to see those scenarios play out and learn from them. But I wonder, so going back to your experience a little bit, you had this big, therapy, psychedelic therapy session, and then what was your ongoing relationship to psychedelics after that, and how has it shifted in the aftermath of that like first big experience?
Even before psychedelic therapy, when I was younger, I took them quite a lot, and I apologize if my mom's watching this, but they probably kept me alive, honestly, when I was younger, and I just didn't realize it. But then after it, they're still a part of my life in a big way. But I don't do them to deal with depression anymore. Mostly now it's kind of like a yearly check-in. It's a sort of intense and strange spa day of sorts for the mind and the body. But they've taught me so much, and they taught me a lot about the mind, not just about like what mental illness is, but they taught me how the mind functions and what's possible in life. I've watched people that I really, really care about also sort of go into that world and find extreme healing and sort of joy and power from them. I'm an extremely curious person, and I've always been very curious about like consciousness itself. And I think anyone who reads like a lot of fiction feels the same way. And I think they've taught me to be a much better writer and a much better sort of listener, but really also like a much better reader in ways that I didn't anticipate necessarily.
Yeah. What do you think would be your advice for someone who is interested in this kind of thing? Or maybe it's a person who's not even like necessarily suffering from depression or mental health stuff, but is interested in psychedelics. What would you say?
Yeah, you don't have to be on death's door to do them. And many, you can really get a lot from them when you're in a healthy state. The thing I tell people is like read about them and learn how they are, because the first thing is when people go to do them is their brain is filled with misinformation. And so they put a tab of acid on their tongue, and then they have a panic attack for 45 minutes because all the stuff that they learned in 8th grade DARE class comes out, all of which was bullshit. The cops were lying, big shock, and you know what I mean? And so learn the truth about them, which is that they're in many ways very, very safe and all that. Doing them responsibly and with people. If you want to do them sort of with a guide and stuff, they're around. Yeah. And it's one of those things. It sounds quite woo-woo, but if you start putting your ear out there about it, the world will kind of. It's like they can smell you. They'll find out that you're looking. Like they'll emerge from a bush. So they hear the call. Someone's like, you want that help, don't you? But that you don't have to be in pain to do them. And the most fundamental thing that they offer, and almost everyone who's done them, even done them recreationally, like in college, I can almost tell if someone's done them or not. And it's just because they understand that what they took to be the world as it is, they really quickly realize is just one manifestation of that, and that there are many different grounds to stand upon. And just that simple lesson goes a long way in how you move through the world, how you treat people, how you relate to your own experience. So yeah, as long as you're doing it safely, don't take them and go bowling, well, but not at first.
Do that on your second.
Yeah, on the second.
I went to a talk a couple years ago by MAPS, that's an organization that does like a lot, has been working to legalize psychedelics and other therapeutic drugs. And I remember one of the things they said that I thought was so interesting was that there's no such thing as a bad trip. It's just a trip that wasn't guided properly. Is that something that you feel? Do you sort of believe that kind of like any trip could be geared toward a therapeutic experience if in the right hands?
Yeah, and it's not even like there's a point that's made in the Pollen book that's very important, which is like just the word, recreation comes from recreate, that there's something even valuable if you do it in a safe way where you're with your friends and you go to listen to music for 5 hours and take some of these and like just let the heart open a little bit. There's something to be gained from that that's quite powerful. But the really challenging stuff can absolutely be guided through. And the guides that I've been around and experienced with are extremely talented people, and they're not really championed enough in the conversation. Everyone kind of ran right to the scientists and left behind the people that have been keeping the stuff alive for 50 years and helping people with it, which is not uncommon because the scientists are the faster way to get to the cash. But like the science is important, the guides are important, but like my own experiences that were the most important experiences in my life besides like meeting my wife are, I got eaten by a gigantic snake. Almost eaten by a gigantic snake the size of Godzilla. Like, would you call that a good time? Probably not. But it was it was one of the best things that ever happened to me, And it kind of obliterates that, it obliterates the binaries of like a good time or a bad time, it was because of that giant, terrifying snake that I suddenly understood the nature of my mind and how fear worked in my body and my mind and how it had hijacked my life. So is it like a bad trip? No. Was it hard? Absolutely. And that's okay. That's great.
Yeah. The book's been out for a little while now. You wrote it even obviously before it came out longer. You've had more you've had a lot of distance from it. What does it feel like, sort of looking back at it now? Like you're very far away from it.
Yeah.
Like what does it feel like when you look at the book now? How do you feel about it?
I feel like I forget that I wrote it. Do you feel that way? Like once I finish something, it's gone. But like the experiences that inspired the book's creation are in my mind every single day, and they will be the rest of my life. But when I go back, today I was reading it real quickly and I was like, that's not bad, Will. Okay. It's not what I'm doing now.
Yeah.
But I look at it and I'm like, you know what? Okay.
Yeah.
It's strange. But I've always been that way. Even before I was a writer, I was a painter, and it's like as soon as I finished this painting that I've been living with for 6 months or something like that, it was as if I had never made it and I had no interest in it and whatever. Let's go on to the next thing.
Yeah. Well, it's a great accomplishment.
Thank you.
Congrats.
Very much.
Everyone should absolutely rush out and get it. I think we have a little time for Q&As. If anyone has any questions they want to ask Will. Yeah, Richie.
I have 2 questions. First, you're a poet too. What was the value of being a poet to writing this book? And then the second question of what value did being a poet have to the psychedelic therapy? Because I imagine experiencing that as a poet is probably different somehow.
Great. So the question was, Will, you're a poet, how did that impact your writing of the book? And then how did that impact your experience of psychedelic therapy?
Yeah.
When it came to writing the book, compression, a certain amount of efficiency, visual clarity, and then especially the book has sometimes very long sentences, and they have, I hope, a kind of deep rhythmic component to them that poetry absolutely taught me how to do. So those are some quick things off the top of the head. And then when it came to this therapy itself, you're kind of a reader of stuff. So when I was watching things unravel, it's as someone who spends a lot of time in the imagination, I could really sit with it and watch the mind do some pretty strange things, but then intuit what they meant. The classic kind of objective correlative model that you learn in poetry applies very well in psychedelic experience. And so I was able to kind of discern what was happening really quickly. And I think a life spent reading like poems definitely held something to do with that. Thank you, Richard Hoffman.
Thank you.
Yeah. PhD. Yeah.
I don't have a PhD.
No.
But I have a question. Which, I mean, first, just a comment that the book has such a beautiful and really complex narrative structure, where we go to many, many different times and places, sort of back and forth. And I felt as a reader that it cohered so beautifully and masterfully, and I think that's a really difficult thing to pull off. And it seems to me that you partially did that through like the train narrative, like constantly coming back to the train. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how your process of determining how to create kind of a narrative through line and how to find coherence in all of these, time-space deviations of the narrative itself.
Yeah, the book, thank you. The book plays around partly because of the subject of physics, but also because of the subject of psychedelics. It plays around with linear time. And so having the train idea just came. We were going to pick my wife's mom up at the airport, and I just stopped and I was like, would you read a book of a guy who's on a train? And Ryan was like, we gotta go. And so we really gotta go. But that just like stuck with me. But in reality, what it did was it allowed me to play around with the experience of consciousness itself, which is that, like, even in this reading, there's been times where maybe even, people in the room, mine has gone to somewhere else where suddenly they're thinking about a fight they got in seventh grade with like a friend or something. That you can be in a place moving through space in a classic sort of Einstein experience of relativity. And then also in your mind, really, you as a person are gone. You're somewhere completely different in the past, and you're experiencing both simultaneously. And so the train kind of gave the book a feeling of propulsion. It was a place to always bring like the reader back to, so they knew what was going on. Plus it was like, oh, what's going to happen? Is he going to get there? Blah, blah, blah. But then through that space, you could watch how a brain has a tendency to peel back or to launch forward. And a brain that just goes way far into the past way too much is a depressed brain. And a brain that goes way too far into the future way too much is an anxious brain. And like playing with those shifts and leaps in narrative and seeing how this person who has a new relationship to their mind is watching the mind move through time and has a completely different relationship to it now, where they don't feel at the whim of it, they kind of control it, is like crucial to articulating how a liberated brain might feel. Does that make sense? Thank you very much. Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about what was so attractive about a professional failure and how that was generated for you?
Yeah, I mean, I, felt like a failure much of my life, I think. Depression, that's kind of one of that's like bread and butter. It gets that brick laid pretty quickly. But like the thing is, like in the book, that there's moments when he's not. He's actually has been successful, even though everything should be otherwise, and yet can't experience it as such. And when I started writing the book, I had written this other novel that, I think was good, but it just wasn't going to work. And so I had this real heavy like anchor of failure on my ankle in a way. And so I was like, well, let's just use that energy as like fuel to put this person's, and I don't know. I mean, I'm guessing a lot of people who write don't know. I don't think they ever actually feel like they've done it or hit it. You know what I mean? But there's a way in which one can feel really at peace with that, and then a way in which one can feel tormented by that. And the difference was he used to feel tormented by it, and I think now kind of laughs at it and is like, yeah, I'm a professional failure. Fuck it. I don't care. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm really, really grateful to be here. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It's a beautiful answer. Thank
Cool.
you. It's a beautiful book.
Yeah, thank you, sir.
I'm curious, sort of, how it felt natural to balance between humor and really heavy subject matter, or sometimes like you're being funny.
Yeah.
And also specifically because a more niche point, because I think about it almost every time I see a chicken. The line is spatchcock the fuck out of the chicken.
Yeah, spatchcock the fuck out of a chicken. Yeah, people are really drawn to that sentence. But I don't know why, but I'll tell you what, when I wrote that sentence, I laughed out loud. I was like, that's exactly the right way to say it. Yeah,
That's the poet in him.
yeah, that's the poet in me, yeah. Put it on my tombstone. You spatchcock. All right, anyways. But the question is, how do I know when, like, humor, when to use it, right? Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to articulate this in an essay right now, actually, but I feel like the literary world is not exactly a barrel of laughs at the moment. I think people have become extremely self-serious. But I think part of that is because there's a grand mistake about what humor is. And I think that when you really experience humor, it's moments when the veils of illusion have been parted, whether they be ego or the concerns of the group or the noise of our current moment are pushed aside for a brief second, and the true nature of reality kind of comes screaming at your face. And it's like a breath of fresh air, even if it's alarming, but that's what causes you to feel something like hilarity, and you just end up laughing. And like an example is like, I got like insanely bad food poisoning last year and had to go to the ER in Paris overnight and stuff. And I was no sooner was I out of the ER that I was like sitting at a cafe with my wife, and like we ordered our coffees and then just started like cackling, laughing, you know? And it was because we had seen, like, that was such a moment that just made everything else that seemed important so obviously not. And I think like anyone who's dealt with like extreme suffering or like recently lost someone, like funerals are quite funny in my opinion, that these really intense moments of experience, humor is almost always there. And it's to refuse it would be the lie. And so when if I'm writing about something like really dark, the humor stuff just kind of naturally bubbles up. I'm not like trying to do it, but I think it has to be there. But it's also there too because it allows us to catch our breath and like process things in a useful way. Does that help? Yeah, thank you. Is there another hand? Yeah.
Well, I haven't read the book, and it's not a literary question, but what sticks in my mind is when you said something about psychedelics really helping you get through your youth.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a personal question because I've just embarking on this myself after I'm 75, after a lifetime of diagnosed bipolar and depression, and like you said, here, take these, you might get better. And basically, you'll shut up more and not be as much of a problem.
Yeah.
So it's a personal question. Is that okay to ask?
Yeah. Let's do it.
Okay. What if you could comment on this? What was the difference between the earlier experiences, which I've had long ago, and the therapeutic experience that brought you out and made a big difference in who you experienced yourself to be and how you experience life in a free way?
Yeah, great. Thank you for that question. And I'm sorry that you're suffering, but there's much hope to be had. And
I opened the door about 6 months ago and I actually had an appointment for ketamine therapy, and then all of the centers went out of business, and I didn't know what that message was about.
Well, hang tight, because the good things are coming, I can assure you. Yeah. Big news is coming. So yeah, the question is, what's the difference between when I took them as a recreational experience when I was younger and then taking them in a therapeutic setting? The difference is like when you're taking them when you're sitting on like a dorm room floor and watching The Wizard of Oz with your friends, is that you're kind of learning just what it's like to even exist in an altered state like that. It's nothing like alcohol. It's all the things we associate with like not being sober. It has no relation to. It often feels actually quite lucid in a strange way. The difference specifically with therapy is that you really prep to do it, and you set what's called like an intention. So when it's like depression, it's like, I want to get through this. I want my life back. I'm tired of dealing with this. I don't want it to be a part of my life anymore. And you work with someone sometimes for weeks or even months, depending on the situation. And when you set that intention, that's what it goes into. It's like what's front of mind is what it goes at. So it's a very kind of calculated experience. And the other thing that's really important to articulate is you're doing it with someone, with a professional who's there, and they're controlling music, they're controlling the temperature of the room, the atmosphere. So I sometimes describe to people as like, if you've ever seen, like deep sea diving, they have the boat up on top and then they let the people go way, way, way down. you know that there's a boat up on the surface and they're watching your air levels and they're making sure that everything's going the way you need it to be, so that you can basically go into the dark and get lost for quite a while. So it's a very like structured, calculated experience with a lot of kind of guardrails, so that you can actually enter something quite strange and big and expansive and then come back knowing you'll be okay. Does that help? Yeah.
Wow, I just checked out a bunch of stuff and it was like $10,000 for a professional. Is that the only alternative, or where can I find that out?
I'll tell you about it later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking.
Really? Okay, maybe one more question for Will. Last question. Yeah.
I have a sort of like super non-intellectual question. If you could rate psychedelic drugs, your favorites, 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
This is good. I love this. I have a tendency to rate things. If people don't know, you can follow me on social media. I've gotten in trouble for rating soups, different chips, sandwiches. Yeah, 90s bands. I should do that. That's intense. Okay, so top three for me are definitely psilocybin's number 1, LSD's number 2, and then this is tough. This gets a little tricky. Let's say there's what's called wachuma, which is like mescaline, but you drink it from a cactus tea, and that was really interesting. But I've only done it once, but that's where I want to go back there. So let's call that number 3 for now.
Perfect.
Yeah. Thank you for the rating question.
What a
Always
note to end
applause.
on.
What a note to
Thank
end
you,
on.
guys.
I'm a real person, I promise. Yeah. Thank you for coming, all of you, my dear friends. Thank you, Daniel.
Can we keep it going for Will Brewer? I'm so appreciative that you let us celebrate your book with you.
Oh, thank you.
So kindly. You brought all your friends. We appreciate it. Daniel, thank you for your close reading and your good questions that brought us all together. I'm so appreciative. I'm just here to tell you that we have copies of The Red Arrow at the front register. You can find them there. We actually have Daniel's book as well.
Buy Daniel's book. It's great.
We
Yeah.
have Daniel's book as well. We also have Will's collection of poetry. You can also pre-order Daniel's book, but anyway, I'm
You
getting
can do it all.
Yeah. You can find them there. You can bring them back here to be signed. Your one homework assignment is that you have to finish that open bottle of wine. I can't do anything with it after tonight, so it's all you. We also have many other books. Please make yourselves comfortable, and I'll see you next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Clark. Thank you, everyone.